Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session for half an hour. Tim Baker's my name, and I'm looking forward to working with you in the next 30 minutes. So let me just share my screen for a minute. So I'm going to look at an interesting topic. I mean, feedback is very elusive because there's a lot of myths around it. But one of the things we know for sure is that feedback does contribute to engagement. In fact, leaders who give regular feedback, and whether that's positive feedback or constructive feedback, actually do build engagement in their team. And that's the good news. The bad news is that leaders who don't give enough feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, probably lead or contribute to disengagement. So there is a link, and I'm going to share with you some research today, which will basically illustrate that and talk about some of the things that you can do in relation to feedback and how to build engagement. We do know from surveys, of course, that most employees are disengaged at work, which is pretty disconcerting. And that happens right across all industries and right across the world. And so it is a real challenge for leaders to find and maintain engaged employees. But feedback certainly has a contributing factor to that. So let me share my screen and then we can launch into the topic. You can see there, of course, that my book, Mastering Feedback, is the essence of the material that I'm going to share with you today. So just a little bit about me. If you don't know who I am, you can see that I'm a keynote speaker. I'm an author. I've written 13 books, of which one of them, of course, is Mastering Feedback. You can see I'm an executive coach, and I also play football, rugby in the Golden Oldies competition in Brisbane. And we only play every couple of weeks because at my age, it takes 2 weeks to recover. So anyway, on with the show. And one of the objections that I anticipate that many managers and leaders share with me is that, if I give people too much constructive feedback, won't they become negative and disengaged? Well, it's possible, depending on how you go about doing it, but the very fact that you're giving constructive feedback to your team is not going to lead to disengagement. In fact, the opposite's true. It'll actually lead to engagement, provided, of course, you do it in the right way. And there are, of course, a number of variables that that are dependent on that. But if you do it the right way, you should get a good result. And I'll share more information about that shortly. So in this short session that we're spending this morning, I'm just going to look at some feedback research that I mentioned before, which does illustrate there is a strong connection between feedback and engagement, and lack of feedback and disengagement. I'm going to talk about the power of catch-ups, and I think that ultimately you need a vehicle to provide this regular feedback, and my view is that regular catch-ups are the way to go. Of course, when business gets in the way, it's often these catch-ups that fall by the wayside, and I think they're really important and highly underestimated. I've also got a special offer that I'll share with you later on in the webinar, but essentially there are three things that we're covering today. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but disengagement is a worldwide problem. Now, it occurs across all industries and it occurs across all countries. So it's not confined to any culture or any industry. So this report, the State of Employee Engagement Report, found that the most prevalent and consistent reason why people leave their job is dissatisfaction with management. So ultimately, the old adage that people leave managers rather than organisations, I think is very true. So I believe that the elephant in the room, if you like, in terms of engagement is often that the relationship the manager has with employees. And one of the ways, of course, that you can improve your relationship with the people you work with is to let them know where they stand. And the way to let them know where they stand, of course, is by giving them regular and consistent feedback. And that's what my book's about. So, and of course, this figure does highlight it, that 75% of people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses. So the problem is, of course, when we have what they call an exit interview, when HR asks people why they're leaving, they often don't give the real reason. And the real reason is usually a relationship problem with their leader. But of course, mentioning that too early can be a little bit threatening to the person leaving. So there's often other factors or other reasons that people give for leaving. But we do know from our research that 75% of people don't quit their jobs. They really do quit their bosses. They've had enough and they want to move on. So it's all about building up good relationships with your team members. And I guess the key way of doing that is by giving regular feedback. I mean, human beings ultimately need to know where they stand. If you think about it, we've got rules and regulations and procedures. Our society is not short of those things. And if you think about it, we'll wonder why that is the case. And the case is that we human beings obviously like to know where that line in the sand is. And feedback is a way of being able to indicate what's appropriate and inappropriate in the workplace. So getting good at feedback would be one of the most fundamental skills that a leader can have to build a good working relationship up with their team members, without a doubt. I believe that the key to doing this is to have regular check-ins, or what we might call catch-ups. I actually prefer the word catch-ups. I think if we call it check-ins, it implies, of course, that the leader is checking up on the particular employee. But I believe these are critically important. I think they should be at least monthly. They don't have to be long. A lot of people think that these catch-ups, take up too much time. But I believe 20 minutes once a month with each direct report can make a significant difference. And of course, it's during those times when you get together with your team members that there are opportunities, of course, to give feedback. It's not just feedback to them, it could be feedback to you as well as their team leader. And I would encourage that if I were you. So I think it's a bit of a myth to suggest that it takes a lot of time. You can have a very productive catch up in 20 minutes, or you can have, time is not the issue here. And I think it's critically important that these happen. And if there was one thing that I wanted you to get out of today, I think it was the idea to keep your catch-ups going on a regular basis, regardless of what's happening around you. And I think what happens, of course, is when there's a crisis, what happens, we tend to put off our catch-ups. And as a result of that, of course, we're sending a very clear message to our team members that these things aren't that important, or at least not as important as the other things that we do in our job. So I would strongly recommend that you do that. Now, I know in some cases people have quite a lot of direct reports, and that's more of a structural issue, but I think really to spend 20 minutes sitting down and not talking about the tasks that are going on at the time, because you're going to have those conversations with people anyway, aren't you? You'll have those in the corridor, and you'll certainly be talking about the work that needs to be done. And for those of you who are working remotely or even in a hybrid format, regardless of your working arrangements, of course, you've now got the technology to be able to still have these catch-ups. So I don't think working remotely is an excuse not to have these regular catch-ups. So implement them and stick to them. And if for whatever reason they get cancelled, then my suggestion is to reschedule them. And I think this is extremely important because it sends a message to your team members that spending quality one-on-one time with each person is extremely important, and you will honour that. And just think for a moment now, I don't know about how large your organization is, but just think for a moment, can you imagine for a moment that if everyone in your company or organization was committed to a monthly catch up with their leader, just imagine if everyone was doing that and it was just part of the deal. This would guarantee a boost to engagement just by doing that. So just think for a moment, if you had 100 people in an organization and everyone was committed, every manager was committed to sitting down with their direct reports once a month for 20 minutes, just think about the difference that that would make. Some people might say that their relationship's so poor with the persons that are reporting to them that it wouldn't be worthwhile doing. Well, it's certainly not going to make it any worse. And if anything, it could make it better. And perhaps one of the reasons that the relationship is lacking trust is because there isn't a regular opportunity to sit down and catch up on a variety of matters. And in one of these sessions, of course, I'll talk about some of the content around what could be included in those catch-ups. So if you're looking at building engagement, that would be the number one tip I'd give you. Now, I want to just share with you this little chart which summarizes some research, and I'll come to the research in a moment. But if you look at the red is disengaged, and if you look at the green, it's engaged. So if we look at the top line here, and this is a summary of the research, and I will back it up with research in a moment. But if you look at the top bar, it's saying that if your employees or the people that report to you, if they only ever received positive feedback from you, so in other words, you're giving compliments on a regular basis and positive feedback to your team members, it's likely that that will boost engagement significantly. Now, I think most of us would accept it's far easier to give positive feedback than it is to give constructive feedback. So you can automatically lift your engagement levels just by being positive and noticing what's going on in the workplace. Granted, when people are working remotely, this isn't so easy to do, but you can still be positive about people meeting deadlines. You can still be positive about the quality of the work that's being done. And I would suggest to you that another good tip would be to set yourself a little goal that every single day, regardless, you will give 3 bits of positive feedback every day. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily the same person, but 3 positive bits of feedback every day. Now, if you do that, you will notice over a period of weeks that your engagement levels will go up. So that's something very simple that you can do immediately. You don't even have to wait for your catch-ups to do that. Now, it gets interesting because in the middle bar there, if your team members only ever receive critical feedback, or what we might call constructive feedback, if that was the only feedback they ever received from you, then you can see that it actually leads to a fair degree of engagement. Because if you look at surveys, employees will often say, I would like more feedback from my manager. Now, that's what people want. And as I said earlier, that's the fact that people want to know where they stand, where the line in the sand is. So if you only ever gave critical feedback, you're still going to have a fair degree of engagement in your team, provided, of course, you do it the right way. It has to be done the right way. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you are not used to giving any feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, this will contribute significantly to disengagement. And we do know that from the research. So the point about this graph is that any feedback, provided it's done in a respectful way, is going to lead to engagement, and a lack of feedback will lead to disengagement. Now, I'll back this up, of course, and give you a bit of a heads up about some surveys. For example, if you look here, now this was a pretty thorough survey by Zenger and Forkman. They surveyed 22,000 leaders, And what they did is they looked at the leaders' feedback practices, and that was the most important thing they looked at. So how often they gave feedback was pretty much the criteria for this research. And it's a pretty big sample, as you can see. Now, what was very interesting in this result in the research is that the research or the results found that employees reporting to the top 10% of managers, now the top 10% of managers were those classified as giving frequent feedback, and that was virtually every day, were 3 times more engaged than the employees with leaders scoring in the bottom 10%. So just by looking at the frequency of people's feedback, it was fairly evident that engagement levels were higher for those managers who were giving daily feedback. So it does suggest very clearly that feedback is extremely important. Now, the flip side's true of this as well. And so if we look at the flip side, and it's perhaps unsurprising, the study also revealed that the bottom 10% of leaders, and when we talk about the bottom 10% leaders, these are the leaders who give very infrequent or no feedback, had employees who would be 3 times more likely to think about quitting. Right, so the survey was done on the top 10% and the bottom 10%. And so really what that means is that the research concluded that employees that receive regular feedback are far more content and willing to exert more effort in their work. That's the bottom line. So I guess the point here is fairly clear, isn't it? And that is that if we're giving regular feedback, then we're likely to engage. And if we don't give regular feedback, we're likely to disengage. The survey also illustrated that the employees themselves were likely to stay longer and have better working relationships with their managers. So, that's some pretty significant research to demonstrate the relationship between engagement and feedback. So if you, of course, want disengaged team members, then the point is don't give any feedback. And of course, if you want high engagement levels, then focus on positives. So as I said earlier, you can start off by giving 3 bits of positive feedback every day, and you'll be well served that way. I think it obviously creates a challenge when you're working remotely because you're not standing there, you're not watching people, but ultimately you're still monitoring what people do, and you can still give feedback on the outcomes of what people do. So if you only ever give constructive feedback, it's significantly better than no feedback at all. And I think there's a bit of a myth that if we only ever give negative or constructive feedback, it's likely that people will get disgruntled and upset and angry and all the rest of it. But the point is that human beings actually need feedback. We all need it. We all want to know. And as I said earlier, that's why our society has so many rules and regulations. So being overlooked is more harmful to employee engagement than having to discuss their areas of improvement with the manager. So if you combine this with these regular catch-ups that I talked about, then you're creating a really good infrastructure to be able to give and improve the quality of your feedback. So I strongly recommend that you consider doing that in your approach. There is a bottom line with all this, and I think this is my key message in our time together this morning, and that is feedback from you as a leader is a valuable resource for the people that you lead, and it signals that you are interested in their performance and development. Now, if you're demonstrating that you're interested in people's performance and development, and there's only one way of doing that, and that's by giving feedback, both positive and constructive, then you'd have to say that's engaging. It's very engaging because you are doing that. Now, I know some people think, well, the last time I gave someone constructive feedback, they got upset. Now, it may well be that they got upset because perhaps you could have improved the quality of the way you gave that feedback. And in my book, there's lots of information on how you can do that effectively. But don't be confused with that. Sometimes people can get upset with particularly constructive feedback. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want it. This is where the problem comes in. Because we see people getting defensive when they get feedback, we might make the assumption that people don't like that or they don't want it. So I'm not going to bother doing that in future. So I'm just going to shut down and not give that feedback. I think if you think that, I think you're wrong about that, because all it does is create some insecurity. Now, obviously, there are a few rules around this. You need to be consistent in your feedback. You must be clear about what your expectations are. You must give that feedback in a respectful way. When I say respectful, I don't necessarily mean that you're not getting to the point, but you do it in a way that's assisting the person to develop their performance and development, not in a way that looks as if it's being highly critical. And I guess what that means is that when you do give feedback to people, there needs to be some developmental opportunity for people to improve. In other words, by all means, you can be critical of someone's performance, and you should be if that performance is suboptimal. But it's important when you sit down with that person that you talk about ways and means of that performance improving in future, and work with that person to be able to improve the quality of their performance. Now, that might mean training and development opportunities. It could mean, coaching. It could mean just simply pointing something out to people and letting them know that it's a priority. Whatever it might be, there has to be a constructive element to the feedback. And that's why I much prefer the term constructive feedback than negative feedback, because constructive implies that it is constructive and that something good can come out of it. And just remember this, that all feedback is actually about the future. So when we give people constructive feedback, we're actually trying to improve their performance in the future. So what that means is that we've got to look at ways and means of being able to do that as the leader. And when we're giving positive feedback, we're also thinking of the future as well, because what we're doing by giving positive feedback is we're trying to reinforce to the person receiving the feedback that we want them to continue that behavior in the future. So it's either about reinforcing positive behavior or perhaps rectifying behavior that isn't necessarily constructive. So I just wanted to point out to you, if you're new to what I'm doing here, you should be aware that every Friday at this time, I always try and make this 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, I have one of these webinars. They're short, they're sharp, they're practical, they get straight to the point. And next week, I just want you to be aware that I'm going to talk about the 7 keys to managing expectations. It's an important topic, because I think unless you're absolutely crystal clear about your expectations and you communicate them effectively, then it's likely that it's going to be very difficult for you to give feedback, because people just aren't clear about what you expect. And there are 7 keys to that. I want to talk about them next week. So please register for that. And of course, you'll get a copy of the slides at the end of this presentation today. And you can see there at the bottom, there's a link, and you just have to click on that link. And just as you did today, you can register for that webinar next week. Now, the other thing I'd like to say just before I conclude today is that just a quick plug for my book. Mastering Feedback will be out the next month or two, and it's a practical book that just looks at things that we looked at today. It goes into depth, the whole notion of how to give feedback, what you need to do and what you shouldn't do. We'll talk about remote feedback and a range of things. So if you would like to pre-order a copy of my book, I'm happy to give you that book for half the price But all you have to do is send me an email by the close of business today, and I'll basically, when the book is published, you will get a signed copy of the book. I will send you an invoice and you'll get the book for half price. As I said, I'll send it out as soon as the book is out, but it'll be about a month or two. So just send me an email, and the book is a relatively short book, but it's a very practical book, and it goes into lots of detail about how to master feedback. So folks, that's it from me, and I hope you enjoyed today. I just got a quick message there. Oh, great, I've got some nice feedback. So thanks, Tim, for another great session. I fully agree with the importance of feedback. Thank you, Craig. That's a very nice bit of feedback. I can accept that. So thank you very much. So thank you, folks. All the very best, and keep your eyes peeled for an email from me, and you'll get a copy of the slides and the recording for taking time out of your schedule to share with me the work that I'm doing in the book, Mastering Feedback. Thanks, everyone, and catch you hopefully next week. All the best. Thank you and goodbye.